The galaxy was cold, not in temperature, but in spirit. For thousands of years, the great civilizations among the stars had learned the same bitter lesson. Emotion was weakness, attachment was danger, and love was the fastest path to extinction. The Crithians had learned this when their empathy nearly destroyed them during the Plague Wars. The Velcrons had learned it when their family bonds made them vulnerable to the hive mind attacks. The ancient Sarathi had learned it so long ago that no one even remembered what tragedy had taught them to lock their hearts away behind walls of ice. Every species that survived long enough to reach the stars had learned to be cold. Cold in negotiation, cold in war, cold in peace. They honored contracts, not friendships. They maintained alliances, not relationships. Their young were raised in collective centers where efficiency and logic ruled over nurture and affection. It was the way of the galaxy, and it had been this way for longer than most civilizations kept records. Then humans arrived, and everything they did was wrong. They sang songs about feelings. They wrote stories about love. They kept animals in their homes for no practical purpose except something they called companionship. They formed bonds with other species, with places, with ideas. They cried at funerals and weddings. They hugged. By all the standards of galactic civilization, they should have destroyed themselves within a generation. But they hadn't. They thrived, and that made them dangerous. The Galactic Council had debated the human question for 3 years. Some wanted them quarantined, contained to their small corner of space where their emotional contamination couldn't spread. Others wanted them studied, dissected to understand how they survived with such fundamental flaws. A few wanted them destroyed before their weakness infected other species. In the end, the Council decided on careful observation. The humans were permitted limited contact with other civilizations, always supervised, always monitored. They were the galaxy's strange curiosity, kept at arm's length like a fascinating but deadly organism. On the colony world of New Terra, in the outer rim of human space, nobody cared much about galactic politics. The settlement was small, just 3,000 people trying to make a life on a planet that was beautiful but challenging. The colonists grew food, built homes, raised children, and generally went about the messy, emotional business of being human. They knew about the Council's restrictions, but out here, with the nearest alien world 3 jumps away, it seemed distant and unimportant. 8-year-old Lily Chen loved the colony's East Meadow. It rolled down from the settlement in waves of purple grass that came up to her waist, and if she climbed the big rock near the creek, she could see all the way to the mountains. She went there most afternoons after lessons, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. Her parents worried a little, but the colony was safe, and they believed children needed freedom to explore. It was very human of them. The dragons had been on the planet long before humans arrived. Not dragons in the fairy tale sense, though they looked similar enough that the human colonists had adopted the name. They were an old species, older than most in the galaxy. They had been spacefaring once, millions of years ago, but they had given it up. The Draxan, as they called themselves, had returned to simpler lives on a handful of worlds, living in mountain caves and remote valleys, hunting and gathering, raising their young in ancient ways. They wanted nothing to do with the galactic community or its cold civilizations. They had tried that path once and rejected it. The dragon elders had not been pleased when humans settled on their world. There had been tense meetings, careful negotiations. But humans, as always, did the unexpected. They offered friendship instead of demanding territory. They asked what the dragons needed rather than asserting what they wanted. They brought gifts and spoke of sharing the planet rather than dividing it. The dragons, surprised and suspicious, had agreed to an experimental coexistence. 3 years later, it was working better than anyone expected, though the 2 species mostly kept to their own areas. Ember was barely 3 months old, which for a dragon meant she was roughly the size of a large dog. With wings she was just learning to use, and fire she couldn't yet control. She had deep red scales that caught the light like rubies, and eyes that gleamed with intelligence her mother insisted was far beyond her age. Like all young dragons, she was curious about everything and listened to warnings about nothing. When her mother told her to stay near the cave, she agreed wholeheartedly and meant it completely, right up until she saw something interesting and forgot entirely. The something interesting was a butterfly. At least, it looked like a butterfly to Ember, though it was actually a local flying insect called a flutterwing. It was bright yellow, and it danced through the air in loops and spirals that seemed designed specifically to entrance baby dragons. Ember watched it from the cave entrance for perhaps 10 seconds before her curiosity overwhelmed her judgment. She bounded after it, her small wings flapping uselessly as she ran through the purple grass. The flutterwing led her on a winding chase down the mountain, across a stream, through a grove of trees, and eventually into the east meadow. By the time Ember lost sight of her prey, she had absolutely no idea where she was or how to get home. She sat down in the purple grass, looked around at the unfamiliar landscape, and for the first time in her short life, felt truly frightened. She let out a small sound, half roar and half whimper, that would have been adorable to anyone who heard it. But there was no one nearby, or so she thought. Lily heard the sound from her spot on the big rock. She had been lying on her back, watching clouds and thinking about nothing in particular, when the strange noise caught her attention. It sounded like an animal in distress, and Lily, being 8 and human, immediately decided she needed to investigate. She climbed down from the rock and pushed through the purple grass toward the source of the sound. When she found Ember, her first thought was that someone had lost a very strange pet. The dragon was small enough that Lily wasn't frightened, and the way it sat there looking lost and scared reminded her of the time her neighbor's cat had gotten out and hidden under their porch. She approached slowly, the way her father had taught her to approach nervous animals, and spoke in a soft voice. "Hey there, little one. Are you lost?" Ember's head snapped up at the sound. She had never seen a human before, certainly not a human child. The being approaching her looked strange and fragile, with no scales or claws or anything useful. But the voice was gentle, and the small face showed concern rather than threat. Ember's instincts, which had been screaming at her to run or hide, quieted slightly. She made another small sound, this one more questioning than frightened. Lily took another step closer. She could see now that this wasn't any kind of pet she recognized. The creature had scales that caught the light, small horns on its head, and wings folded against its back. She had seen pictures in the colony's information center of the dragons that lived in the mountains. This must be a baby dragon. She had never met one before. The adults were huge and kept to themselves, but this little one looked terribly lost and scared. "It's okay," Lily said, kneeling down a few feet away. "I won't hurt you. Are you by yourself?" Ember tilted her head, studying this small human. The words meant nothing to her. Dragons and humans hadn't established any kind of common language yet, but the tone was clear enough, and something about this strange creature's presence was calming. Ember took a tentative step forward, then another. Lily held very still, barely breathing, watching as the baby dragon approached. When Ember was close enough, she stretched out her neck and sniffed at Lily's hand. The human smelled odd but not dangerous. Warm, alive, friendly. Lily slowly extended her hand, letting the dragon examine it. When Ember didn't pull away, Lily gently touched the scales on the dragon's head. They were warm and surprisingly smooth. Ember made a sound that might have been a purr, or might have been something entirely different. Whatever it was, it sounded happy. Lily smiled. "You're really pretty, you know that?" What happened next was not planned by either of them. Ember, feeling suddenly safe and comforted by this strange, gentle creature, did what baby dragons do when they feel secure. She pressed forward and wrapped herself around the source of comfort. Her small body curved against Lily's legs and chest, her wings folded in, her head tucked against the child's shoulder. It was a dragon hug, the first one Ember had ever given to anyone who wasn't family. Lily's surprise lasted only a moment, then her 8-year-old human heart did what human hearts do when presented with something small and scared that needs comfort. Her arms came up and wrapped around the dragon baby, holding her close. She felt the warmth of the scales, the rapid beat of the dragon's heart, the slight tremble that said this little creature had been more frightened than she'd let on. Lily hugged tighter, and Ember burrowed closer, and for a long moment they stayed that way. Two children from different species, finding comfort in each other on a purple meadow under an alien sun. Neither of them noticed the observation drone floating silently 50 feet overhead. The Galactic Council had sensors and cameras scattered across human space, part of the monitoring program. The drones were sophisticated, able to record and transmit data across the galaxy through quantum communication networks. This particular drone had been following Lily, not because she was special, but simply because it was programmed to document human behavior, especially involving their young. The council wanted to understand how humans raised children, what methods they used, what made these dangerous, emotional beings tick. The drone's artificial intelligence had no emotions of its own, no capacity to be moved by what it witnessed. It simply recorded the image of a human child hugging a baby dragon, tagged the file with relevant markers, and transmitted it to the council's central database, along with thousands of other observations. The AI assigned the moment no special significance. It was just another data point in the endless study of humanity. But the image was clear, perfect in its clarity. Two young beings from species that barely knew each other, wrapped in an embrace that spoke of trust and comfort and care. The AI had no way to know that this particular data point would change the galaxy, that this single moment, transmitted as routine observation, would spread across civilizations like wildfire, that within days, trillions of beings would see this image, that hearts, thought frozen beyond any thaw, would crack and break and bleed at the sight of it. The AI simply filed its report and moved on to track another colonist. It had done its job. It had recorded the truth. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. On New Terra, unaware of the drone or the destiny of that moment, Lily and Ember stayed locked together a while longer. Eventually, Ember pulled back, looking up at Lily's face with those intelligent eyes. Lily smiled at her. "We need to find your family. I bet they're really worried about you." She stood up, and Ember stayed close to her legs, following as Lily began to walk in the direction she thought the mountains lay. It took them an hour, with Ember occasionally trying to fly short distances and Lily doing her best to guide them toward the dragon territories. They were singing, or rather, Lily was singing, and Ember was making sounds that might have been attempts to join in when they encountered the search party. Ember's mother, a dragon named Sanctuary, who had lived 200 years and survived the plague wars before retreating to this quiet world, had been searching frantically for her missing daughter. She had called other dragons to help, and they had spread across the region in growing panic. When Sanctuary finally spotted Ember walking calmly through the grass next to a human child, her relief was so intense it was followed immediately by fury at the human who had clearly stolen her baby. She dove from the sky with a roar that shook the meadow, landing hard enough that the ground trembled. She was enormous, 40 feet long with wings that blotted out the sun, scales like rubies but darker, aged by time and experience. Fire sparked around her jaws as she advanced on the child, who stood frozen in terror. Ember, seeing her mother, squealed with delight and bounded forward, completely missing the threat display. She reached Sanctuary and immediately began chirping excitedly, pressing against her mother's leg, then turning to look back at Lily as if to say, "Look, I made a friend." The incongruity of it stopped Sanctuary in her tracks. Her daughter wasn't hurt or frightened or traumatized. She was happy, excited, and clearly trying to tell her mother about something wonderful. Lily, for her part, had backed away when the huge dragon landed, but she hadn't run. She was terrified, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. but she stood her ground. The little dragon had been lost and scared, and Lily had helped her. She hadn't done anything wrong. If the big dragon didn't understand that, well, Lily would just have to explain, even if her voice shook when she tried. "I didn't hurt her," Lily called out, proud that her voice only trembled a little. "She was lost. I was helping her find you." Sanctuary understood enough human language to grasp the meaning. She looked at her daughter, who was still radiating joy and excitement, then back at the small human who stood there shaking but defiant. The fire around Sanctuary's jaws faded. She lowered her head, studying Lily with ancient eyes. What she saw confused her. The child was genuinely afraid but held her ground. The child had clearly been with Ember for some time, and Ember was unharmed and happier than she'd been in days. The child's body language showed no aggression, no desire to possess or control, just concern, care, exactly the kind of emotion Sanctuary had been taught was weakness, but that she herself felt in a wave of confusing intensity. Other dragons were landing now, part of the search party. Behind Lily, human colonists were running into the meadow, alerted by the roars and the sight of multiple dragons. The situation could have turned dangerous quickly, two species facing off over a misunderstanding. But Ember, oblivious to the tension, made everything clear in the way only children can. She bounced between her mother and Lily, chirping at both of them, her joy obvious. She wanted her mother to like her new friend. She wanted her friend to know she was safe. She wanted everyone to understand that something wonderful had happened, not something scary. Sanctuary looked at her daughter, then at the human child, then back at her daughter. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her head fully to the ground in front of Lily, a gesture of thanks and apology among dragons. Lily, not knowing what it meant but understanding the tone, took a shaky breath and bowed back. Behind her, she heard her parents calling her name, relief in their voices. She turned and ran to them, and they caught her up in hugs and tears and rapid questions about whether she was hurt. The colonists and dragons faced each other across the meadow for a long moment. Then, one by one, they withdrew, the humans returning to their settlement, the dragons returning to the mountains. But something had shifted. Something had changed in that moment when a child helped a lost dragon, when a mother saw a human show her daughter nothing but kindness. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the wall between two species. But cracks let light through, and light grows. That night, Lily's parents debated whether to report what had happened to the colony administrator. They decided not to, treating it as a private incident that had resolved peacefully. But they told their neighbors, who told their friends, who told their family members. Within days, everyone in the colony knew the story of little Lily Chen, who had helped a baby dragon find her way home. The humans smiled when they heard it, their hearts warming at the tale. It was such a human story, such a typically human thing to do. They felt proud of their daughter, their colony, their species' tendency to help those who needed it. In the dragon caves, Ember told the story too, in chirps and excited gestures that her mother translated for the other adults. The dragons listened with mixed feelings. Some dismissed it as childish foolishness that would lead nowhere. Others felt stirrings of something they had thought long buried, something that remembered a time before they had learned to be cold. Sanctuary said nothing, but she found herself thinking about the human child who had stood her ground despite obvious terror. That took courage. That took heart. The Draxen had once valued such things, before they learned to value survival above all else. Neither species knew that the story was also spreading far beyond their planet. The image captured by the Council's drone had been processed, filed, and distributed as part of the regular intelligence reports sent to all Council members. It should have been lost in the flood of data, just another observation in millions. But a Velcrin analyst named Thresh had seen it while reviewing the day's reports from human space. Something about the image made him pause, made him look twice, made him save it to his personal files, something he had never done before with any intelligence report in 30 years of service. Thresh didn't know why the image affected him. The two children hugging shouldn't have meant anything to him. The Velkrans had abandoned such displays generations ago. His own offspring had been raised in communal centers, and he had held them perhaps twice in their entire lives, both times for medical necessities. That was normal. That was proper. That was how civilized species ensured survival. But looking at the image of the human child and dragon baby wrapped in that embrace, Thresh felt something move in his chest, something he didn't have words for, something that hurt and healed at the same time. He sent the image to his breeding partner, Vesa, with a single question. "Do you remember when we held our first?" Vesa didn't respond for 3 hours. When she did, her message was brief. "I dream about it sometimes. I wonder if that makes me defective." Thresh stared at that message for a long time. Then he forwarded the image to 5 colleagues he trusted, people he'd worked with for years. He didn't include any message, just the image. Within a day, all 5 had responded. Each response was different, but the emotion underneath was the same. Longing, recognition, pain, the acknowledgement that something had been cut away from them that might have been worth keeping. One of those 5 colleagues sent the image to her family group chat. Another shared it on a secure Velkran social network he belonged to. A third included it in a presentation about human behavioral patterns, intending it as an example of their dangerous emotionalism. But what he said about it and what people saw in it were two different things. The image began to spread, slowly at first, then faster. From Velkran to Velkran, network to network, world to world. And with it spread something the Velkrans had thought they'd successfully suppressed. Memory, longing, the ghost of what they'd once been before they learned to be cold. The Krithians received their copy of the intelligence report 3 days after it was filed. Their review board consisted of 15 senior administrators who evaluated all information regarding human activities. They met in a chamber designed for maximum efficiency, seats arranged in a circle, lighting calculated to maintain alertness without causing fatigue. The image was displayed on the central screen, along with hundreds of other observations. It should have taken 30 seconds to review and dismiss. Instead, the meeting ground to a halt. Administrator Kelvin, who had served on the review board for 23 years and had seen every kind of human behavior the Council's drones could capture, couldn't tear his eyes from the image. Neither could anyone else in the room. They sat in silence, 15 of the most logical, rational, carefully controlled minds in Krithian civilization, and stared at 2 children hugging. The silence stretched from seconds to minutes. Finally, the youngest member of the board, Administrator Lauren, spoke. "Why does this hurt to look at?" It was the wrong thing to say. Admitting to emotional pain was not done in Krithian culture, certainly not in professional settings. Lauren should have been reprimanded immediately, but instead Kelvin heard himself responding. "Because we remember." Another long silence. Then another administrator. "My parent held me once. When I was very young and had injured myself, I thought I'd forgotten." Another. "We had songs about embracing. Before the Plague Wars. I found one in the ancient archives. I didn't understand why anyone would sing about something so simple." Another. "Is it simple? It looks simple, but it doesn't feel simple." The meeting ended without any official decision on the intelligence report. The image was filed as significant for reasons the board couldn't articulate, but all 15 administrators took copies with them. And like the Velkrons, they shared it. Some shared it privately, with family or close associates. Others shared it more widely, on Krithian cultural forums or historical research networks. Each time it was shared with the same unspoken question. Do you feel this too? The Sarathi received their copy through official channels 5 days after the image was captured. The Sarathi were the oldest cold civilization, the ones who had been at it longest. They had refined their emotional suppression to an art form over thousands of years. Their culture prized logic above all things, and they had built a civilization of stunning technological and philosophical achievement. They were also, by all measures, the loneliest species in the galaxy, though they would never have used that word or admitted to that feeling. The Sarathi Review Council consisted of 3 individuals, rotated monthly from a pool of proven logical thinkers. They met only virtually, communication happening through text to eliminate any potential emotional contamination from voice or body language. The image was presented as item 7042 on their review list. It was assessed by the first reviewer in 14 seconds. Human behavior, typical emotional display, no strategic significance, archive and dismiss. The second reviewer spent 18 seconds and provided the same assessment. The third reviewer was named Solus, and Solus did something unprecedented. He flagged the image for extended analysis and requested a full council meeting, in person, to discuss it. The request was bizarre enough that it was granted simply out of curiosity about what would make a rational Sarathi want such a thing. The 3 reviewers met in a chamber that hadn't been used for in-person meetings in 47 years. Solus displayed the image on a large screen and asked his colleagues to look at it for a full minute without speaking. They complied, confused but willing. 60 seconds passed. Then Solus asked them a single question. What did we lose? It was perhaps the most dangerous question a Sarathi could ask. Their entire civilization was built on the assumption that they had lost nothing, that they had instead gained everything by abandoning emotional weakness. But both reviewers, staring at that image, found they couldn't dismiss the question as easily as they should have. One of them, Mira, responded slowly. Logic suggests we lost nothing. We chose evolution over stagnation, survival over sentiment. Solus nodded. That's what logic suggests. What do you feel? The question hung in the air like a physical thing. Feelings were not discussed among the Sarathi. Feelings were irrelevant. But looking at the image, both Mira and the third reviewer, Dante, found that they had an answer. Mira spoke first, her voice uncertain. I feel like I'm looking at something I've never seen, but somehow remember. Like a dream of something real. Dante added, I feel like we're missing from this picture. Not us specifically, but our species. We should be there somehow, but we're not. We're somewhere else, somewhere colder. The meeting lasted 6 hours, which was 6 hours longer than any Sarathi review meeting in living memory. They didn't reach any conclusions. They didn't make any decisions. They simply talked, the 3 of them, about what they saw in the image and what it made them think, and hesitantly, what it made them feel. When they finally ended the meeting, they didn't file a report. They couldn't have explained what the meeting was for or what it accomplished. But all 3 of them kept copies of the image, and all 3 of them independently began to share it with other Sarathi, with colleagues, with family, with anyone they thought might understand the question, what did we lose? Within 2 weeks of the original observation, the image had spread to 47 different species across the Galactic Council. It moved through official channels and unofficial ones, through intelligence networks and social media, through academic circles and family groups. Everyone who saw it had their own reaction, their own interpretation. But across species and cultures, one response was nearly universal. The image made people feel something, and that feeling was dangerous. It was dangerous because most of the galaxy had spent generations learning not to feel, and suddenly they were reminded of what that cost. They were reminded that they had once been different, that their species had once held their young and sung songs and formed bonds that went deeper than logic. They were reminded that they had chosen coldness, and that choice had left scars they'd forgotten how to recognize. The Galactic Council's official response took 3 weeks to formulate. When it came, it was measured and careful. The Council acknowledged that an image from the Human Monitoring Program had achieved unexpected distribution across member networks. They noted that some individuals had reported psychological discomfort when viewing the image. The official recommendation was that the image be classified as culturally significant human behavior, and that exposure be limited to trained analysts who could view it with proper context and detachment. The council carefully did not say that the image should be suppressed or banned. That would give it too much power, admit too much significance. Better to categorize it, contextualize it, and let the moment pass. But moments like this don't pass. They spread. They grow. They change things in ways no council can control. On New Terra, completely unaware that her moment with Ember had gone viral across the galaxy, Lily Chen returned to the East Meadow every day for a week, hoping to see her dragon friend again. She didn't tell her parents where she was going, sensing they'd worry or forbid it. She just went, sitting on the big rock, watching the sky in the meadow, hoping. On the 8th day, Ember found her. The baby dragon came gliding in on wings that were stronger than before, landing clumsily but enthusiastically in the purple grass. She bounded over to Lily with obvious joy, and Lily slid off the rock to greet her, laughing as Ember pressed against her legs. They spent the afternoon together, playing in the meadow. Lily showed Ember how to play tag, which the dragon didn't quite understand but enjoyed anyway. Ember showed Lily that she could breathe small puffs of fire now, which both impressed and slightly worried the human child. They sat together in the grass and watched the clouds, though Ember got distracted easily and wanted to chase things. When the sun began to set, Sanctuary appeared overhead, calling for her daughter. This time there was no threat in her arrival. She landed more gently, further away, and waited while Ember said goodbye to Lily in her own dragon way, pressing her head against the girl's chest one more time before bounding over to her mother. Lily waved as the dragons lifted into the sky. Sanctuary, before flying away, met Lily's eyes for a long moment. Something passed between them, some acknowledgement that transcended species. Then the dragons were gone, silhouettes against the sunset. Lily walked home feeling happier than she had in weeks. She didn't know that versions of herself and Ember were being viewed by trillions of beings across the galaxy. She didn't know that she'd become a symbol of something dangerous and beautiful. She just knew she'd made a friend, and maybe she'd see her again tomorrow. The meetings started small. On the Velcrin homeworld, Thresh organized a gathering of 12 people who had all responded strongly to the image. They met in a private space, not sure what they wanted to say or do, just knowing they needed to talk with others who felt the same strange stirring. That gathering lasted 4 hours and ended with no conclusions, except the decision to meet again. The next meeting had 30 attendees. The one after that had over 100. What started as an undefined need to discuss became something more organized. They began calling themselves the Remembrance Movement, and their purpose was simple. Remember what the Velcrin species had been before they learned to be cold, and explore whether any of it was worth reclaiming. The Crithian gatherings were more philosophical in nature. Groups of administrators, teachers, and cultural historians began meeting to discuss the concept of emotional expression in historical Crithian culture. They reviewed ancient texts, studied pre-Plague War artwork, and compiled evidence that their species had once been very different. Some argued that the old ways led to the vulnerabilities that nearly destroyed them. Others countered that the new ways had saved them from destruction, but left them in a state of half-life, surviving but not truly living. The debates were careful, measured, very Crithian in their execution. But beneath the logic, emotion was beginning to flow again, like water finding cracks in a dam. The Sarathi response was the most surprising. Solus, Mira, and Dante published a paper titled The Calculus of Loss, Measuring What Cannot Be Quantified. It was couched in mathematical and logical terms, a proper Sarathi academic work, but the content was revolutionary. They argued that the Sarathi had made an error in their calculations when they decided to abandon emotional connection. They had failed to account for non-material costs that nonetheless had real impacts on individual and collective well-being. They proposed that the Sarathi species was suffering from what they called connection deficit, and that this deficit had measurable negative effects on creativity, innovation, and even on basic life satisfaction scores, which had been declining slowly for centuries. The paper should have been dismissed immediately as illogical, unscientific, and dangerous. Instead, it became the most downloaded academic work in Sarathi history. Millions read it, tens of millions discussed it. The establishment condemned it, but the condemnation felt hollow. Too many people recognized the truth in what Solus, Mira, and Dante were saying. Too many people had been feeling the lack without having words for it. The paper gave them words. It gave them permission to question whether the cold way was really the only way, or even the best way. 6 months after the image was captured, the Galactic Council could no longer ignore what was happening. Across dozens of member species, movements were forming. Calls for cultural reevaluation, debates about emotion and connection, studies of pre-cold civilizations, and all of it traced back to a single image of a human child hugging a baby dragon. The council convened an emergency session to address what they termed the contagion of human emotional contamination. The debate was fierce. Some council members demanded immediate action, stronger restrictions on human contact, possibly even quarantine of human space. Others argued that suppression would only make the problem worse, that the movements forming across the galaxy were internal matters for each species to address. The human representatives to the council, who had mostly been decorative figures up to this point, listened to the debate with growing frustration. Finally, Ambassador Teresa Kim asked to speak. As the most junior member of the council, she technically had no right to address an emergency session, but the council chair, tired of the circular arguments, granted her request. Teresa stood and looked around the chamber at representatives from dozens of species, all of them upset about an image of a child and a dragon hugging. When she spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "You're afraid of a hug. That's what this is really about. Not human contamination or cultural instability. You're afraid that your people are remembering how to care about each other, and you think that will destroy them. But look at us. Humans are built on emotion. We cry, we laugh, we love, we mourn. We form bonds with each other and with anything else that will hold still long enough. By your logic, we should be the weakest species in the galaxy. We should have torn ourselves apart with internal conflicts and poor decisions driven by feelings rather than logic. But we didn't. We're here. We've survived everything the universe threw at us. We've even started to thrive out here among the stars. And do you know why?" The council chamber was silent. Teresa continued, "Because connection doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong. When you care about each other, you fight harder to protect each other. When you love your world, you work harder to preserve it. When you bond with allies, you create trust that survives disagreements. What you call weakness is actually our greatest strength. And maybe, just maybe, it used to be yours too, before you forgot." The speech should have been dismissed immediately, but the chamber stayed silent for a long moment after Teresa sat down. Finally, a Crithian representative spoke. "The human makes an interesting argument. Perhaps we should consider whether our species' current difficulties with innovation and morale might be related to what she describes as connection deficit." Another representative. "The Velcrin population has been in slow decline for 3 generations. We attributed it to conscious reproductive choice. But what if it's because we no longer want to bring children into a world where they won't be held or loved?" Another. "The Sarathi suicide rate has been climbing for centuries. We treated it as a statistical anomaly. What if it's a symptom of a deeper problem?" The meeting ended without any official decisions. The council couldn't agree on whether human emotion was a contagion to be contained or a cure to be studied. In the end, they did what councils do when faced with questions they can't answer. They formed a committee to study the issue further and agreed to reconvene in 6 months. But the real decision had already been made, out in the galaxy, by millions of individuals who had seen the image and felt something stir inside them. They had decided to remember. they had decided to feel. They had decided that maybe being cold wasn't actually the only way to survive. On New Terra, the friendship between Lily and Ember deepened over the following months. They met regularly in the East Meadow, and slowly other humans and dragons began to join them. At first it was awkward, two species that had kept apart trying to figure out how to interact. But children led the way, as children often do. A human boy named Thomas started playing chase with Ember's brother Spark. A dragon child named Flame showed a group of human kids how to catch fish from the creek with their claws. Parents from both species watched nervously at first, then with growing comfort as they saw their children laughing and playing together without any of the careful distance that had marked human-dragon relations before. Sanctuary found herself in conversation with Lily's mother, Elena. It started with simple coordination about when the children should return home, but it grew into something else. They discovered they had similar concerns about their children's safety, similar hopes for their futures, similar frustrations with trying to balance protection and freedom. That Elena had no scales and Sanctuary could breathe fire seemed increasingly less important than the fact that they were both mothers trying to do their best. When Elena mentioned that she sometimes felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising a child in a colony world far from extended family, Sanctuary admitted that she sometimes felt isolated in the dragon caves, that their community was smaller than it once was, that she worried about Ember growing up with too few companions her own age. They were sitting on rocks, overlooking the meadow where their children played. Elena said, "You know, when I first came to New Terra, I was scared. Everything was so different from Earth. But then Lily was born, and I realized that the scary new world was going to be her home, and I needed to make it a good one for her." Sanctuary considered this. "When we came to this world millions of years ago, we were running from something. War, I think, though the details are lost. We were so tired of fighting, so tired of losing those we cared about. We decided it was safer not to care at all. But watching Ember with your daughter, I wonder if we lost something more important than what we were protecting." More humans and dragons began talking. Not constantly, not even often, but regularly enough that it became normal to see mixed groups in the meadow or near the creek. They shared food, which led to interesting discoveries about what each species considered edible. They shared stories, which required patience and creativity to overcome language barriers. They shared space, which required trust. And slowly, carefully, they began to share friendship. Not the alliance of convenience they'd had before, but genuine connection. The coldness that had kept them separate began to thaw. The changes on New Terra were small, but they were noticed. The Council's monitoring drones continued their observation, sending back reports of increasing human-dragon interaction. Analysts noted it. Some were concerned, but others saw it as a natural extension of the pattern the original image had shown. Two species learning to be less cold, together. It wasn't dangerous, just different. And different was what humans had always been. The Council continued to watch, but they didn't intervene. Partly because they couldn't agree on what intervention would look like. Partly because many of them were beginning to wonder if intervention was necessary or even wise. 1 year after the original hug, Lily turned 9. Her parents threw her a birthday party, a very human tradition. They invited Lily's human friends, naturally, and then Lily asked if she could invite Ember. Elena and her husband, David, exchanged glances. They'd become comfortable with the human-dragon friendship, but inviting dragons to a birthday party felt like crossing a line they weren't sure existed. But looking at Lily's hopeful face, they couldn't say no. Elena went to the meadow and, through a combination of words and gestures, invited Sanctuary and Ember to the party. Sanctuary's surprise was evident, but she agreed. The party was chaotic in the way children's parties always are, but the addition of young dragons made it memorably so. Ember tried to help blow out the candles and nearly set the entire cake on fire. Spark accidentally broke a table while trying to play a human party game. A dragon child named Crystal got tangled in streamers, and panicked until 3 human kids and Lily worked together to free her, all of them laughing by the end. The adult humans and dragons watched from the edges, bemused and slightly anxious, but mostly charmed by the absolute chaos of children being children together. At the end of the party, when most guests had left, Ember approached Lily with something in her claws. It was a stone, smooth and red, about the size of Lily's palm. Ember pressed it into Lily's hands and chirped softly. Sanctuary, standing nearby, translated, "It's a heartstone from our caves. Dragons give them to those they consider family." Lily looked at the stone, then at Ember, then threw her arms around the dragon in a hug that was becoming familiar to both of them. "Thank you, I'll keep it forever." A council drone captured that moment too. The image of Lily hugging Ember for the second time, a year after the first, spread across the galaxy almost as quickly as the original. But this time, the response was different. People had spent a year thinking about the first image, feeling what it stirred in them, debating what it meant. When they saw the second image, they saw proof that connection could last, that the warmth of that first moment hadn't been a fleeting thing, that a human child and a dragon could be friends, real friends, over time, that what they'd been taught to believe was weakness might actually be strength after all. The movements that had formed in response to the first image gained momentum. The Velcron Remembrance Movement organized the first public embrace event in their species' modern history. 10,000 Velcrons gathered in a central plaza and, awkwardly at first, but with growing confidence, hugged each other. It lasted for hours. Many wept, some from joy, some from the realization of how much they'd missed such simple physical connection. The government tried to shut it down but couldn't. There were too many participants, and they weren't doing anything violent or illegal. They were just holding each other. How do you criminalize a hug? The Crithians took a more measured approach, as was their nature. They established connection centers, where people could go to practice emotional expression in controlled environments. Trained facilitators help participants talk about feelings, form bonds, and even engage in physical affection like holding hands or embracing. The centers were controversial, but they were also overwhelmed with requests for access. Waiting lists stretched for months. Clearly there was hunger for this among the Crithians, even if it made their leadership uncomfortable. The Sorathi surprised everyone. 300 of their most prominent citizens, including Solus, Mira, and Dante, issued a joint declaration called the Reconnection Manifesto. It argued that the Sorathi had lost their way, that their pursuit of pure logic had led them down a path that denied essential aspects of their nature. The manifesto called for a cultural renaissance, a return to emotional authenticity combined with their logical strengths. It proposed that logic and emotion weren't opposites, but complementary forces that, together, made a complete being. The manifesto was condemned by the Sorathi government. It was also signed by 3 million citizens within a week. The changes weren't universal. Many species, many individuals resisted. They argued that the old ways existed for good reasons, that emotion had nearly destroyed them once and would do so again if they let it back in. They pointed to human history, which was indeed full of wars and atrocities driven by passion and prejudice. They insisted that the cold way was the safe way, the only way to ensure survival in a dangerous galaxy. And they had a point. The cold civilizations had survived a long time. But survival isn't the same as living, and more people across the galaxy were starting to understand the difference. The Galactic Council's follow-up meeting, 6 months after the first emergency session, was very different in tone. The human quarantine question was dropped without discussion. Instead, the council debated what their role should be in the cultural shifts happening across member species. Some argued the council should lead the way, that they should officially acknowledge the value of emotional connection and encourage member species to explore it. Others insisted the council should remain neutral, letting each species make its own choices. In the end, they settled on a compromise. The Council would establish an interspecies cultural exchange program that would facilitate contact between different species, including humans, for the purpose of sharing cultural practices and learning from each other. It was a cautious step, carefully worded to avoid seeming like the Council was endorsing any particular approach to emotion or connection. But it was a step, and everyone knew what it meant. The galaxy was changing, the Council was acknowledging it, and humans, who had always been the strange, dangerous outliers, were suddenly at the center of the conversation. 2 years after the first hug, Lily was 10, and Ember was roughly equivalent to a teenager in dragon development. They still met regularly, though not as often as before. Life had grown more complicated for both of them. Lily had more schoolwork, responsibilities in the colony. Ember was learning to hunt with her mother, spending more time in the dragon caves. But their bond hadn't weakened. If anything, it had deepened, the way friendships do when they survive the test of time and change. When they did meet, they fell into comfortable patterns. Sometimes they talked, with Ember understanding more human language now, and Lily learning some dragon gestures. Sometimes they sat in silence, just being together. Sometimes they played like they had when they were younger, and sometimes they hugged, because that's what friends do when they care about each other. The galaxy changed around them, slowly, unevenly, with plenty of resistance and setbacks, but changed nonetheless. The Velcrons established family connection days, where parents were encouraged to spend unstructured time with their children, including physical affection. Birth rates began to climb for the first time in generations. The Crithians revised their educational system to include emotional intelligence alongside logical reasoning. Student satisfaction and performance improved. The Sarathi elected a new council that included several signatories of the Reconnection Manifesto. One of their first acts was to establish public spaces designed for social gathering rather than efficient transit, places where people could simply be together without purpose or agenda. Other species watched these changes with interest and varying degrees of concern. Some began tentatively implementing their own versions of reconnection programs. Others doubled down on traditional coldness, viewing the changes elsewhere as weakness they could exploit. The galaxy didn't suddenly become warm and fuzzy. There were still conflicts, still exploitation, still cruelty, but something had shifted. The assumption that coldness was strength and emotion was weakness no longer went unchallenged. People across dozens of species were reconsidering what they'd lost and whether it could be reclaimed. They were taking risks on connection that their ancestors would have considered suicidal. And mostly, they were finding that those risks were worth taking. The human colonies continued to grow. More species began establishing diplomatic relations with humanity, curious about these beings who had somehow survived while violating every rule the galaxy thought necessary for survival. Human merchants started appearing in alien markets. Human scholars attended alien universities. Human artists performed in alien venues. And everywhere humans went, they brought their dangerous, contagious warmth with them. They asked personal questions. They shared meals. They formed friendships. They hugged. And slowly, the beings they encountered began to remember that they could do those things too. That their species had once done those things before they forgot. The humans didn't preach or evangelize. They just were themselves, authentically and unapologetically emotional. And that authenticity was more powerful than any argument could have been. On New Terra, the human colony and the Dragon Clan held a joint harvest festival, celebrating the third year of successful coexistence. It was a chaotic affair, mixing human traditions with dragon customs in ways that didn't always make sense, but felt right anyway. There was music, both human and dragon, which sounded strange together, but created something new and interesting. There was food, with humans trying dragon cuisine and dragons trying human dishes, both groups making faces at some of the stranger offerings, but game to try. There was dancing, which looked ridiculous when humans and dragons tried to do it together, but was fun anyway. And there were hugs, lots of them, between children and adults, humans and dragons, friends and family. Casual, natural, unremarkable. What had once been shocking was now normal. That's how change happens. Not in dramatic moments, but in the slow accumulation of new normals. Ambassador Teresa Kim visited New Terra as part of a diplomatic tour. She wanted to see the place where the famous image had been captured, wanted to meet the child and dragon who had accidentally changed the galaxy. She found Lily and Ember in the East Meadow, which had become something of a pilgrimage site for those interested in the reconnection movement. They were teaching a mixed group of younger children how to play a game that seemed to be a hybrid of human tag and dragon aerial chase. Teresa watched for a while before introducing herself. Lily was polite, but clearly more interested in getting back to the game. Ember was curious about this human who had come from far away, but equally eager to return to play. Teresa smiled at their impatience. "I just wanted to thank you," Teresa said. "What you two started, it's changed things, made the galaxy a little warmer." Lily looked confused. "We didn't start anything. We're just friends." Teresa laughed. "Yes, exactly. You're just friends. And somehow that was revolutionary." She didn't stay long. She could see that Lily and Ember didn't fully understand their significance, and that was probably healthy. Let them be children, be friends, without the weight of galactic importance. The moment they'd shared had gone out into the universe and done its work. They didn't need to carry that burden themselves. That night, Teresa sent a report back to the human government and to her colleagues on the Galactic Council. She described what she'd seen on New Terra, the easy mixing of two species that had once kept careful distance. She talked about the changes she'd observed throughout her tour, species that were rediscovering emotion and connection. And she made a recommendation. Let it continue. Don't control it. Don't try to direct it. Don't turn it into policy or program. Just let beings across the galaxy figure out for themselves what kind of relationships they want, what kind of lives they want to live. Let the warmth spread naturally, the way it had started, from a simple moment between two children who saw each other not as human and dragon, but as two beings who could be friends. The recommendation was accepted. The Galactic Council scaled back its monitoring of human space, reducing the number of observation drones and limiting surveillance to genuine security concerns. Humans were granted fuller membership in the galactic community, with fewer restrictions on contact and travel. It wasn't a sudden embrace, but it was progress. The galaxy was learning to see humans not as a dangerous anomaly, but as a reminder of something it had forgotten. Not that humans were perfect. They had their own problems, their own darkness. But they also had something many species had lost: the courage to feel, to connect, to love, even knowing those things could hurt. That courage was worth learning from. 5 years after the first hug, Lily was 13 and preparing to attend a mixed-species youth academy being established on a neutral station. Ember was fully grown now, massive and magnificent, capable of flying distances her mother could barely imagine. They had both changed so much from the children they'd been in that meadow, but their friendship hadn't changed, not in the ways that mattered. The night before Lily left for the academy, they met in the East Meadow one last time. The purple grass was as soft as ever, the sky as beautiful. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They sat together and watched the sunset, Lily leaning against Ember's side, feeling the warmth of her scales, the slow rhythm of her breathing. When the stars came out, Ember spoke in the dragon way Lily had learned to understand. "Will you come back?" "Of course I'll come back. This is home. You're here." Lily felt Ember's relief in the way the dragon's body relaxed. "I'll be here. Always." They sat a while longer. Then Lily stood and wrapped her arms around Ember's neck, holding tight. Ember curved her body around Lily, wings folding in, creating a shelter, a sanctuary. They stayed that way for a long time, two beings from different species, different worlds, connected by something stronger than difference. love, friendship, the warmth that melts cold hearts and bridges impossible gaps. When they finally let go, both knew they'd see each other again, but the hug was important anyway. It was a promise, a reminder, a renewal of the bond they'd formed years ago when a lost baby dragon met a kind human child in a purple meadow. Across the galaxy, trillions of beings were learning to hug again, to hold each other, to form bonds they'd been taught to fear. Not all of them, not even most of them, yet, but enough. Enough that the cold that had gripped the galaxy for so long was beginning to thaw. It would take generations to undo the damage of isolation, to relearn what had been forgotten. But it was happening. And it had started with a single moment, captured by a drone, spread across the stars. A human child and a dragon baby, wrapped in an embrace that said more than words could express. That said, "You're not alone. I see you. I care about you. We're connected." The galaxy had thought such things were weakness. A child and a dragon proved they were strength. And the cold hearts across the stars, one by one, began to remember how to feel warmth again.